The training facility on Kepler Station buzzed with the usual mix of alien cadets from across the galaxy. The massive hangar stretched for kilometers, filled with combat simulators, weapon ranges, and tactical training grounds. Here, the Galactic Defense Coalition prepared young warriors from dozens of species to face the growing threat of the Void Hunters, an ancient enemy that had begun stirring again after centuries of silence. Marcus Chun sat in the corner of the mess hall, picking at his protein ration while listening to the chatter around him. At 17, he was one of the youngest humans ever accepted into the program, and definitely the only one whose grandfather had never served in any official military capacity. While other human cadets boasted about their family service records in the Terran Defense Force or their participation in the Mars Colonial Wars, Marcus kept quiet about his own family history. The conversation at the nearby table grew louder as Zexhai, a towering Crothery warrior with blue-scaled skin and, for arms, regaled his squad, mates with tales of his ancestors' conquests. The Crothery were known throughout the galaxy as one of the most formidable warrior races, their military traditions spanning thousands of years. Zexhai's voice boomed across the mess hall as he described how his great-grandfather had single-handedly held off an entire Void Hunter swarm ship during the siege of Altair Prime. "My bloodline has been forged in battle for over 2 millennia, Zexhai declared, his secondary arms gesturing dramatically while his primary hands remained folded across his chest. "Every male in my family has achieved the rank of war leader or higher. When I graduate from this program, I'll be the youngest Crothery ever to command a battle squadron." Other cadets gathered around, sharing their own family legends. Velana, a graceful Etherian with translucent skin that shifted colors with her emotions, spoke of her mother's psychic victories against the Shadow Collective. Thrak, a massive, stone-skinned Goliathan, rumbled about his father's engineering core that had built the defensive installations around the Outer Rim worlds. Marcus tried to focus on his food, but the conversation kept drawing his attention. These beings came from warrior cultures that had been fighting galactic conflicts for generations. Their families were legends, their bloodlines proven in combat across multiple star systems. What could he possibly contribute to such a gathering? "What about you, human?" Zexhai's voice cut through Marcus's thoughts like a plasma blade. The entire mess hall seemed to quiet as attention turned to the young man in the corner. "You've been unusually silent about your family's military service. Surely the newest species to join the coalition has some warriors worth mentioning." Marcus looked up to find dozens of alien eyes fixed on him. Some showed genuine curiosity, others displayed barely concealed contempt. Humans had only joined the Galactic Defense Coalition 15 years ago, and many of the older species still viewed them as primitive newcomers who had barely figured out faster-than-light travel. "My family doesn't really have a military background," Marcus said quietly, hoping the conversation would move on to someone else. Zexhai's laugh was harsh and grating. "No, a military background? Then what are you doing here, little mammal? This is a warrior's academy, not a school for merchants and farmers." The mess hall erupted in various forms of alien laughter. The Crothery's companions joined in, their scales shifting to darker hues that indicated amusement. Even some of the more civilized species couldn't hide their smirks at the humans' apparent inadequacy. Marcus felt his cheeks burning, but something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the dismissive way Zexhai had called him little mammal, or maybe it was the weeks of subtle condescension he'd endured since arriving at the station. Whatever the reason, he found himself standing up and facing the towering alien warrior. "Actually, my grandfather did see some action," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "He was involved in what we call the Pacific Theater during World War II. Zexhai's 4 eyes narrowed with interest. "World War II? I'm not familiar with this conflict. Was it a significant engagement?" Marcus nodded, warming to his subject despite his nervousness. "Pretty significant, yeah. My grandpa was a mechanic on the USS Enterprise. He helped keep the fighters running during some major battles." The mention of his grandfather brought back memories of the old man's stories, told during long summer evenings on the back porch of their family farm. Grandpa Joe had always been modest about his service, claiming he'd just been a grease monkey who kept the planes flying while braver men did the real fighting. But Marcus had always sensed there was more to those stories than his grandfather let on. A mechanic? Zexai's voice dripped with disdain. You're bragging about an ancestor who fixed machines while others fought? This is what passes for warrior heritage among humans. The laughter grew louder and more cruel. Marcus felt his face reddening as he realized how pathetic his family history must sound to these beings whose ancestors had conquered star systems and led armadas across the galaxy. A mechanic on some primitive aircraft carrier, hardly compared to Crothry war leaders or Etherian battle psychics. He wasn't just a mechanic, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He was part of something important. They called it the greatest generation because they what? Zexai interrupted, rising from his seat to his full 3-meter height. Because they managed to repair primitive flying machines, while their betters did the actual fighting? Child, my ancestors were leading space fleets when your species was still hitting rocks together to make fire. The Crothry warrior took a step closer, his presence intimidating and overwhelming. Marcus could smell the alien's musk, sharp and acrid like burning metal. Zexai's scales had shifted to a deep red pattern that other cadets recognized as aggressive display coloration. Perhaps you should reconsider your place here, little mammal. The Galactic Defense Coalition needs warriors, not the descendants of mechanics and farmers. Your species may have stumbled into space travel, but that doesn't mean you belong among true fighters. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Around him, the mess hall had fallen into expectant silence. Some aliens watched with cruel anticipation. Others seemed genuinely curious about how the human would respond to such a challenge. A few appeared uncomfortable with the confrontation, but none moved to intervene. The young man felt completely out of his depth. These beings came from cultures that had been testing themselves in combat for millennia. Their understanding of warfare and honor had been shaped by conflicts spanning multiple star systems and thousands of years. What did he know about any of that? He was just a farm kid from Iowa who'd scored well on the coalition aptitude tests. My grandfather, Marcus stammered, but the words wouldn't come together into anything coherent. Zexai's laugh was triumphant and harsh. Exactly. You have nothing. No warrior tradition, no battle honors, no bloodline worth mentioning. You're here because your species needed to fill their quota, not because you earned your place through strength or heritage. The Crothry warrior reached out with one of his secondary hands, intending to pat Marcus on the head in a gesture of condescending dismissal. It was a calculated insult, the kind of gesture one might use with a child or pet rather than a fellow warrior. The slap came without warning. The sound echoed through the mess hall like a gunshot. Zexai's primary hand had moved faster than most eyes could follow, striking Marcus across the face with enough force to send the young human staggering backward into his chair. The alien scales had shifted to a deep purple, indicating satisfaction and dominance. Know your place, little mammal, Zexai said coldly. Perhaps pain will teach you what words could not. Marcus pressed his hand to his stinging cheek, tasting blood where his teeth had cut the inside of his mouth. The metallic flavor triggered something primal in him, but he forced himself to remain seated. Fighting back would only prove their point about human primitiveness. And, besides, what chance did he have against a trained Crothry warrior? The mess hall remained silent, except for the low hum of the life support systems. Other cadets watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, but none moved to intervene. This was clearly seen as an internal matter between Marcus and Zexai, a dominance display that would establish the pecking order among the cadets. You see, Zexai addressed the room at large. This is what happens when inferior species attempt to rise above their station. Humans may have discovered space travel, but they lack the fundamental warrior spirit necessary for true military service. Several aliens nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable but remained silent. The social dynamics of the training station were complex, with species forming alliances based on centuries of galactic politics and mutual prejudices. Humans, as the newest members of the coalition, occupied the lowest rung of this hierarchy. Marcus wiped the blood from his lip and tried to stand, but Zexai's massive hand pressed down on his shoulder, forcing him back into his chair. The Crothry's grip was crushingly strong, his claws digging slightly into the human's uniform fabric. "Stay seated, mechanic's grandson," Zexai said with mock gentleness. "Let this be a lesson to you and your kind. The galaxy is not a place for the weak or unworthy. Perhaps you should consider transferring to the logistics division, where your limited heritage might be more appropriate." The suggestion drew renewed laughter from Zexai's supporters. The logistics division was generally viewed as a dumping ground for species and individuals deemed unfit for actual combat roles. Assignment that would effectively end any hope Marcus had of proving himself as a warrior. "My grandfather wasn't weak," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the station. Zexai leaned closer, his alien features twisted in amusement. "What was that, little mammal? Did you say something?" "I said my grandfather wasn't weak," Marcus repeated, his voice stronger this time. "And neither was his generation." The Crothery scales shifted to a darker red, indicating rising aggression. "Still clinging to your pathetic family myths? Your grandfather fixed flying machines, child. My ancestors conquered star systems. There is no comparison." Marcus felt something building inside him, a mixture of anger and pride that his grandfather had always warned him about. "You don't know anything about my grandfather," he said, meeting Zexai's four-eyed glare, "or about what his generation accomplished." "Then, enlighten me," Zexai said with exaggerated patience. "Tell me about these great accomplishments of your primitive ancestors." Marcus took a deep breath, remembering the stories his grandfather had told him during those long summer evenings. The old man had been reluctant to talk about the war at first, but eventually the memories had come pouring out. Stories of courage and sacrifice, of young men facing impossible odds with nothing but determination and ingenuity. "They saved their entire world," Marcus said simply. "My grandfather's generation fought against an enemy that had conquered half the planet. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing technology that seemed impossible to defeat. But it didn't give up." Zexai's expression remained skeptical. "One world? You're talking about the conquest of a single planet, as if it were a significant military achievement." "It was to us," Marcus replied. "And it wasn't just about conquest. The enemy they fought, they were trying to eliminate entire peoples, entire cultures. They built factories specifically designed to murder millions of civilians. Children, elderly, anyone they deemed inferior." A few of the alien cadets shifted uncomfortably. Genocide was not unknown in galactic history, but it was generally considered the mark of truly barbaric civilizations. The fact that humans had faced such an enemy on their own homeworld cast their early history in a different light. "My grandfather told me about a battle called Midway," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "The Japanese fleet outnumbered the Americans 3-1. They had more ships, more planes, more experienced pilots. But my grandfather's generation figured out their plans and set a trap." Zexai's scales had shifted to a more neutral blue, indicating curiosity despite his earlier contempt. "A trap? Explain." "The Americans knew they couldn't win a straight fight, so they used intelligence and tactics instead. They positioned their carriers to catch the enemy fleet when it was most vulnerable. My grandfather was on the Enterprise when they launched their attack. He said the deck was so full of planes they could barely move around." Marcus paused, remembering his grandfather's description of that morning. The old man's eyes had grown distant as he talked about the controlled chaos of a carrier deck during combat operations, the smell of aviation fuel and the roar of engines, the knowledge that every mistake could mean death for dozens of airmen. "The attack was supposed to be coordinated," Marcus continued, "but everything went wrong. Squadrons got separated, radios failed, Navigation errors sent planes in the wrong directions. By all rights, it should have been a disaster. And was it? Asked Valena, the Therian cadet. Her skin had shifted to pale gold, indicating genuine interest. Marcus shook his head. That's when something happened that my grandfather said he'd never seen before or since. Even though everything had gone wrong, even though the plan had fallen apart completely, individual pilots and crews started making their own decisions. They knew what needed to be done, and they did it without orders. He looked around the mess hall, noting that more cadets were listening now. Even some of Zexhi's supporters had stopped their conversation to hear the story. One squadron of torpedo bombers attacked without fighter escort, knowing they'd probably all be shot down. They were. All of them died, but they drew the enemy fighters down to sea level. When the dive bombers arrived a few minutes later, there was nothing between them and the Japanese carriers. Marcus's voice had taken on some of his grandfather's cadence, the way the old man had told these stories with quiet pride and lingering sorrow. In 5 minutes, they sank 4 aircraft carriers. The entire balance of power in the Pacific shifted because a bunch of farm boys and mechanics and college students decided they'd rather die fighting than live as slaves. The mess hall had grown completely quiet now. Even the background conversations had stopped as Marcus's words carried across the space. After that, Marcus continued. My grandfather spent the rest of the war keeping those planes flying. 18-hour days in the middle of the ocean, working on engines with nothing but basic tools and spare parts. No fancy technology, no automated systems. Just human hands and human ingenuity keeping the war machine running. Zexhi's scales had shifted through several colors during the story, finally settling on a mottled pattern that suggested confused emotions. This is interesting, he admitted grudgingly. But still, you speak of primitive combat with obsolete weapons. How does this compare to true galactic warfare? Before Marcus could answer, the mess hall doors slid open with a soft hiss. The man who entered the mess hall moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. He was clearly human, though older than any of the cadets, with graying hair and hands stained with machine oil. His coveralls bore the insignia of the maintenance department, marking him as one of the civilian contractors who kept the station systems running. Most of the alien cadets barely glanced at him. Maintenance workers were common throughout the station, and their presence was generally ignored by those focused on military training. This man looked like any other mechanic, unremarkable except for the way he carried himself and the quiet intensity of his pale blue eyes. Marcus, however, recognized him immediately. The blood drained from his face as he saw his grandfather standing in the doorway of the mess hall, taking in the scene with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Joe Chun had aged since Marcus last saw him, but he still moved with the purposeful economy of motion that had characterized him throughout his life. At 87, he should have been retired, enjoying his golden years on the family far back on Earth. Instead, he'd taken a contract job maintaining the fighter systems aboard Kepler Station, claiming he was too restless for retirement. Marcus, the old man said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent mess hall. Everything all right here, son? The young man felt his throat constrict. Having his grandfather witness his humiliation somehow made everything worse. Here was the man whose stories had inspired him to join the coalition, and now Joe would see how poorly his grandson measured up to the galaxy's warrior elite. Everything's fine, Grandpa, Marcus managed, though his swollen lip made the words slightly slurred. Just having a discussion about family history. Joe's eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the assembled alien cadets, the obvious tension in the air, and the defensive way Marcus was sitting. When his gaze settled on Zexhi, the old man's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his posture. Family history, Joe repeated thoughtfully. That's always an interesting topic. Mind if an old mechanic joins the conversation. Zexhi's scales had shifted to a wary orange pattern. Something about the older human's presence seemed to put him on edge, though he couldn't identify exactly what. The man was clearly just a maintenance worker, hardly worth the attention of a Crothry warrior in training. We were just explaining to your grandson that this academy is meant for warriors, Zexai said dismissively. Perhaps he didn't understand what he was getting into when he applied. Oh, I think he understands just fine, Joe replied mildly, walking further into the room. Marcus has heard plenty of stories about what warriors do. Haven't you, son? Yes, sir, Marcus said quietly, still mortified by his grandfather's presence, but beginning to notice something odd. The other human maintenance workers who'd been scattered throughout the mess hall were now moving closer, their casual conversations having stopped. It was subtle, but they were definitely repositioning themselves. The boy was telling us about World War II, Zexai continued, his tone suggesting this was barely worth mentioning. Some primitive conflict on your homeworld. We were trying to explain that such small-scale fighting has little relevance to modern galactic warfare. Joe nodded thoughtfully, his hands clasped behind his back in a way that seemed casual, but somehow made several of the alien cadets shift uncomfortably in their seats. World War II, the old man mused. Now that takes me back. You were telling them about Midway, Marcus? A little bit, Marcus admitted, about how the pilots kept fighting even when everything went wrong. Good story, Joe agreed, though I always prefer the one about the Doolittle raid. 16 bombers launching off a carrier deck to bomb mainland Japan, knowing they didn't have enough fuel to make it back. Every single crew volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. He looked around the room, noting how the aliens were listening despite themselves. Or maybe the story about the Marines at Guadalcanal. 6 months of fighting in a jungle hell, outnumbered and undersupplied, but they held their ground because they knew what would happen if they didn't. Zexai's scales had shifted to a deeper orange, with hints of red beginning to show. These are interesting stories, old man, but they're hardly relevant to modern warfare. Your species was fighting with chemical propellants and metal projectiles. We're talking about plasma weapons, energy shields, and faster-than-light combat. You're absolutely right, Joe agreed amicably. Technology's come a long way since then. Though I have to say, some things never change. The old man walked over to where Marcus was sitting, his movements still casual, but somehow more purposeful. Mind if I take a look at that lip, son? Looks like you might have taken a hit. Before Marcus could protest, Joe had gently tilted his grandson's face toward the light, examining the cut with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of injuries over the years. Now, that's interesting, Joe said softly, but his voice carried clearly in the silent room. Looks like someone hit you. In my day, we had a saying about that. Talk softly and carry a big stick, though I always preferred the variation my drill sergeant used to say. What's that? Asked Throck, the Goliathan cadet, his stone features showing curiosity. Joe's smile was gentle, almost grandfatherly. He used to say, be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The old man's words had been spoken in the same mild tone he'd used throughout the conversation, but somehow they carried an entirely different weight. Several of the alien cadets exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that something had shifted in the dynamics of the room. Zexai's scales had gone completely red now, a clear sign of aggression and challenge. Are you threatening me, old man? Threatening? Joe looked genuinely puzzled. No, son, just sharing some wisdom my old drill sergeant passed along. Sergeant Morrison was a Marine who'd seen action in the Pacific. Tough old bird, taught us young mechanics a lot about staying alive. He straightened up, his examination of Marcus's injury complete, and for the first time the assembled cadets got a good look at his eyes. They were the pale blue of winter ice, and there was something in them that spoke of experiences far beyond maintaining aircraft engines. The thing about World War II, Joe continued conversationally, is that it taught us a lot about human nature, about what people are capable of when they're really pushed. Take the Eastern Front, for instance. The Germans thought they were fighting primitive Slavs who'd collapse after a few good battles. His hands moved to his coverall pockets, a gesture that seemed innocent but somehow drew the attention of every person in the room. Instead, they found themselves fighting people who'd rather burn their own cities than let them be occupied. People who'd hold a single building for months, fighting floor by floor, room by room, until nothing was left but rubble and corpses. Joe's voice remained calm, and conversational, but there was something underneath it now, something that made even the largest aliens in the room pay attention. Or the Pacific Theater, where Japanese soldiers who'd been trained from birth to view death in battle as the highest honor found themselves facing American farm boys who just wanted to go home. Turns out, people fighting to protect their families are harder to kill than people fighting for honor. Zexai had risen to his full height again, his forearms spread in an aggressive display. Enough of these primitive stories, old man. Your grandson insulted my heritage, and I put him in his place. That's the end of it. Is it? Joe asked mildly. See, that's where you and I might have a difference of opinion. The mess hall had become absolutely silent, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone present realizes they're about to witness something significant. Joe Chun stood relaxed and casual, his hands still in his pockets, looking up at the towering Crothery warrior with the mild interest of someone discussing the weather. You see, Joe continued, his voice still conversational, there's something about humans that other species sometimes miss. We're not naturally the biggest, or the strongest, or the most advanced. But we have this peculiar trait that shows up when we're pushed too far. Zexai's scales had shifted through several aggressive colors, and were now settling into a pattern of deep red with black edges, indicating a readiness for violence. And what trait is that, old man? We get creative, Joe said simply. Around the room, the other human maintenance workers had continued their subtle movement. What had seemed like casual repositioning now revealed itself as something far more deliberate. Every exit was covered, and the aliens suddenly found themselves outnumbered by humans who no longer looked like simple mechanics. Take the Doolittle raid I mentioned. Joe continued, apparently oblivious to the tension building around him. The problem was simple enough. We needed to bomb Japan, but their mainland was too far from our carriers. Conventional wisdom said it was impossible. He pulled his hand from his pockets, revealing fingers that were indeed stained with machine oil, but also bore several small scars that spoke of experiences beyond routine maintenance work. So we did something nobody expected. We stripped down B-25 bombers, modified them for carrier operations, and launched them off the deck of the USS Hornet. 16 bombers taking off from a space barely long enough for fighters. Velana, the Therian cadet, had gone completely transparent with shock. That sounds incredibly dangerous. Oh, it was, Joe agreed cheerfully. 15 of the 16 crews crash-landed or bailed out over China. Most of them spent the rest of the war as prisoners or guerrilla fighters. But they proved something important that day. His pale blue eyes fixed on Zexai with laser intensity. They proved that when humans set their minds to something, conventional limitations don't apply anymore. The Crothery warrior's 4 hands had curled into fists, his claws extending slightly. Are you trying to intimidate me with stories of primitive aircraft, mechanic? Oh, I'm not trying to intimidate anybody, Joe replied mildly. I'm just explaining why hitting my grandson might not have been the smartest thing you've done today. The old man's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but suddenly he no longer looked like a maintenance worker. The way he held himself, the way his weight was distributed, the subtle positioning of his feet all suggested someone who knew exactly how to move in a fight. You see, Zexai, Joe continued, and several aliens jumped slightly at his casual use of the Crothery's name. There's something you should understand about human families. We're pack animals, social creatures. When you hurt one of us, you're not just dealing with an individual. You're dealing with the whole pack. Marcus stared at his grandfather in amazement. This was not the gentle old man who'd told him bedtime stories and taught him how to fix engines. This was someone else entirely, someone who'd been hiding behind the facade of a simple mechanic. My grandfather was a mechanic, Marcus had said earlier, and technically that was true. But as Joe continued speaking, it became clear that his wartime service had involved considerably more than just maintaining aircraft. I spent 4 years in the Pacific, Joe said conversationally. Officially, I was an aviation mechanic assigned to the USS Enterprise. Unofficially, well, let's just say that when you're fighting an enemy who doesn't believe in surrendering, you learn to be flexible about job descriptions. He took a step closer to Zexhai, his movement fluid and controlled. I was at Guadalcanal when the Japanese tried to retake Henderson Field. 6 months of hell, they called it. Marines holding a strip of jungle against everything the enemy could throw at them. The old man's voice took on a harder edge, though his conversational tone never changed. I was at the Philippine Sea when we broke the back of Japanese carrier aviation. I was at Leyte Gulf when we destroyed their main battle fleet. And I was at Okinawa when they threw everything they had left at us, including 10-year-old boys with bombs strapped to their backs. Around the room, the alien cadets were beginning to understand that they might have seriously misjudged the humans among them. These maintenance workers no longer looked like simple technicians. They moved with the controlled precision of trained fighters, and their eyes held the flat, watchful quality of people who'd seen combat. The thing about war, Joe continued, is that it teaches you things they don't cover in training manuals, like how to field strip and reassemble an M1 carbine in complete darkness, or how to rig explosive charges from spare parts when your demolition expert gets killed, or how to kill an enemy soldier with nothing but a wrench and the element of surprise. Zexai's aggressive posture had begun to waver slightly. Something in the old man's tone suggested these weren't hypothetical scenarios, but actual memories being shared. But the most important thing war teaches you, Joe said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, is how to recognize when someone needs killing. The mess hall had become tomb quiet. Even the station's ambient noise seemed muted as every being present focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Joe Chun stood looking up at the alien warrior with the calm patience of someone who'd faced death before and wasn't particularly worried about facing it again. Now, Joe said, his tone returning to its earlier conversational level, I'm going to give you a choice, son. You can apologize to my grandson for hitting him, and we can all pretend this was just a misunderstanding between young people getting to know each other. He paused, his pale eyes never leaving Zexhai's face. Or you can continue down the path you're on and find out what happens when you pick a fight with humans who've stopped pretending to be civilized. The Crothery scales had gone through several color changes during Joe's speech, finally settling on a mottled pattern that suggested confusion and growing uncertainty. Zexhai was a trained warrior, bred for combat from birth, but something about the elderly human's absolute confidence was deeply unsettling. You're just a mechanic, Zexhai said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Joe's smile was gentle and grandfatherly, but there was something predatory lurking beneath it. Son, in my experience, the most dangerous humans are the ones who know how to fix things. Because if you understand how something works, you also understand how to make it stop working. He gestured casually around the room, indicating the other maintenance workers who had somehow positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the space. Take my friends here. Between us, we've got about 200 years of combined military experience. We've maintained everything from fighter aircraft to nuclear submarines. We know how every system on this station works, from life support to artificial gravity. The implications of that statement hit several of the alien cadets simultaneously. These weren't just maintenance workers. They were people who could shut down the station's systems at will, who had access to every critical component that kept several thousand beings alive in the vacuum of space. But here's the thing, Joe continued, his voice still maddeningly calm. We're not here to threaten anybody. We're just simple mechanics, doing our jobs, taking care of the equipment that keeps everyone safe. Unless someone gives us a reason to be something else. His eyes fixed on Zexhai again, and this time the Crothery actually took a step backward. So what's it going to be, son? Apology, or do we find out what a bunch of creative humans can accomplish when they put their minds to it? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Zexhai stood frozen, his forearms trembling slightly as he processed the implications of what he'd just heard. The other alien cadets watched in fascination and growing alarm as they realized the true nature of the humans they'd been dismissing as primitive newcomers. Around the room, the human maintenance workers waited with the patient stillness of predators. It didn't look threatening in any obvious way, but their positioning was perfect, their attention focused, and their readiness unmistakable. These were people who'd learned to fight dirty in wars where survival mattered more than honor. Marcus watched his grandfather in amazement, seeing him clearly for the first time. The gentle old man who'd taught him to fix engines and told him stories on the back porch was still there, but now Marcus understood there had always been something more. Joe Chun was a veteran of humanity's most brutal conflict, a survivor who'd spent 4 years learning that sometimes civilization was a luxury you couldn't afford. Zexai began, then stopped, his scales cycling through confused patterns of color. His warrior training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for facing an opponent who wielded quiet menace with such casual precision. Take your time, Joe said encouragingly. It's an important decision, the kind that shapes how people remember you. Velana, the Etherian cadet, had recovered enough from her shock to speak. Mr. Chun, she said carefully, her skin shifting to respectful purple, we didn't realize your service record wasn't in our briefing materials. Joe's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. That's because it's classified, miss. A lot of what happened in those days is still sensitive information. The galaxy wasn't ready to hear about some of the things humans did to survive that war. He gestured around the room, indicating his fellow maintenance workers. Most of us old-timers don't talk much about it. We came out here to do honest work, keep the machinery running, help train the next generation. We're not looking for trouble. His eyes returned to Zexai, and the temperature seemed to drop again. But we're not going to stand by and watch someone abuse our kids either. Throck, the massive Goliathan, shifted uneasily in his seat. The Galactic database lists human military capabilities as minimal. Early space-age technology, limited combat experience beyond planetary conflicts. The database is correct, Joe replied calmly. We are early space-age, technologically speaking. We've only been off-world for about 70 years, only had faster-than-light travel for 20. Most galactic civilizations were exploring star systems when we were still figuring out agriculture. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. But here's what the database doesn't mention. We spent the first half of the 20th century perfecting the art of killing each other on an industrial scale. 2 global wars, dozens of smaller conflicts, weapons that could level cities and poison the ground for generations. Marcus found himself leaning forward, hearing parts of human history he'd never learned in school. His grandfather's generation had lived through something the rest of the galaxy couldn't fully comprehend. World War II alone killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, Joe continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. We invented new ways to destroy entire populations, new strategies for targeting civilians, new technologies specifically designed for maximum killing efficiency. The alien cadets exchanged glances, beginning to understand why human military history might be classified information. The scale of destruction Joe was describing was beyond anything most galactic species had experienced. We bombed cities until nothing was left but rubble and ash, Joe said quietly. We developed weapons that turned human beings into shadows burned into concrete. We created systematic methods for murdering millions of people in factories built specifically for that purpose. His pale eyes swept the room, noting how every alien present was now paying absolute attention. And then, when it was over, we looked at what we'd done and decided we never wanted to be that species again. We spent the next 50 years learning to be better than our worst impulses. Joe's expression softened again, returning to the grandfatherly demeanor Marcus remembered. That's why we joined the Galactic Coalition. We wanted to be part of something bigger than ourselves, something that stood for protection instead of destruction. We wanted to use what we'd learned in service of peace. He looked directly at Zexai again, his voice gentle but implacable. But that doesn't mean we've forgotten how to fight when we have to. It just means we're more careful about when and why we choose violence. The Crothry warrior's scales had gone through several more color changes, finally settling on a pale blue that indicated deep uncertainty. Everything he'd been taught about humans as primitive newcomers, was being systematically dismantled by an elderly mechanic who spoke about mass destruction with the casual familiarity of lived experience. The stories I told my grandson weren't myths or legends, Joe continued. They were things I saw with my own eyes. Young men who flew their planes into enemy ships because it was the only way to stop them. Soldiers who held impossible positions because surrender wasn't an option. Civilians who chose to die fighting rather than live as slaves. He took another step closer to HFY, and this time the towering alien didn't back away, though his 4 hands remained clenched in nervous fists. Marcus comes from that tradition, Joe said firmly. His great-grandfather died at Normandy, storming a beach against machine gun fire because someone had to be first. His other great-grandfather spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp and never gave up information that would have gotten his friends killed. The old man's voice carried a note of pride now, the deep satisfaction of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst and its best. So when you slap my grandson and call him weak, you're not just insulting him. You're insulting everyone who died to give him the chance to be here. Marcus felt tears stinging his eyes as he finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all those years. The stories weren't just family history. They were a legacy of courage and sacrifice that stretched back through generations of ordinary people who'd chosen to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Now, Joe said, his tone returning to conversational calm, I believe someone owes someone an apology. HFY looked around the room, seeing his fellow cadets watching with a mixture of fascination and expectation. The dynamics had shifted completely. Where he'd once held dominance through size and aggression, he now found himself facing something far more dangerous. Humans who'd stopped pretending to be harmless. The Crothery scales cycled through several patterns before finally settling on a deep purple that indicated shame and recognition of error. Slowly, with visible effort, he lowered himself until he was kneeling beside Marcus's chair, bringing his eyes level with the young humans. I apologize, HFY said formally, his voice carefully controlled. I spoke in ignorance and acted without honor. Your heritage is clearly more significant than I understood. Marcus looked at his grandfather, who nodded encouragingly, then back at the alien warrior. Apology accepted, he said quietly. And HFY, your ancestors sound pretty impressive too. Maybe sometime you could tell me more about those battles at Altair Prime. The Crothery's scales shifted to a surprised orange, then gradually to the pale blue of relief and gratitude. Ah, yes. I would be honored to share those stories. Joe nodded approvingly and clapped his hands together, the sharp sound breaking the tension that had filled the room. Well then, that's settled. Nothing like a good conversation to help people understand each other. He looked around at the other maintenance workers who had begun to relax and resume their casual positions. Gentlemen, I think it's time we got back to work. These young people have training to complete, and those fighters won't maintain themselves. As the older humans began filing out of the mess hall, Joe paused beside Marcus's chair and placed a gentle hand on his grandson's shoulder. You did good, son. Sometimes standing up for yourself is about more than just personal pride. Grandpa, Marcus said quietly, why didn't you ever tell me about all of that? Joe's smile was sad and wise, carrying the weight of experiences Marcus was only beginning to understand. Because I hoped you'd never need to know. I hoped your generation would get to grow up in a universe where the only fights worth having were the ones you chose, not the ones forced on you. He glanced around at the alien cadets, who were watching the interaction with newfound respect and curiosity. But it looks like you're going to do just fine. You got good instincts, and you're not afraid to stand up for what matters. That's all any of us can ask for. As Joe walked toward the exit, he paused one more time to look back at the assembled cadets. One more thing for you young warriors to remember, he said with a gentle smile that somehow managed to be both warm and terrifying. The most dangerous enemy is the one who doesn't look dangerous. We humans learned that the hard way. The mess hall doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the cadets in contemplative silence. The social dynamics of the training station had shifted permanently, and everyone present knew it. Humans were no longer the primitive newcomers to be dismissed or condescended to. They were something far more complex and potentially dangerous, survivors of a history that had forged them into something the galaxy had never seen before. Marcus looked around at his fellow cadets and saw something new in their eyes. Not fear exactly, but a careful respect tinged with genuine curiosity. For the first time since arriving at the station, he felt like he truly belonged among these warriors from across the galaxy. After all, he came from a long line of people who'd learned to fight for what mattered, and that was a tradition worth carrying forward into the stars.